Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of Beyond the Cage. I'm your host, Jim Gramm, and on today's show, we're going to talk a few headlines here in the world of combat sports. Then we are going to break down UFC Fight Night 88 from this past weekend in Las Vegas, and then I will pick the main card fights for UFC 199 on pay-per-view this weekend from the Forum in Los Angeles, California. Once again, I'm your host, Jim Gramm. You can follow me on Twitter at Jim Gramm. I'm also on Instagram at the Jim Gramm. And if you ever want to follow me on Snapchat, I'm Hawkeye on Snapchat as well. Cover my bases there. And of course, like the show here, Beyond the Cage on Facebook, facebook.com/Beyond the Cage podcast. We are just 30 likes away until 500. We're going to give away around, I think, 11 or 12 signed 8x10 photos from some MMA fighters such as Joe Schilling, Darren Cruikshank, Dwayne Ludwig, Brian Ebersol, Steven Seiler, Rad Martinez. I'm forgetting some of the other names we have. We have a huge list. You'll see the photos there. Johnny Bedford is one as well. You'll see the complete group of photos there on our Facebook page. Again, facebook.com/Beyond the Cage podcast. If you haven't already liked our page yet today, to get the info on that contest. And again, the contest will not start until we get to 500 likes. Again, we are 30 likes away until we hit that. And of course, I'm coming to you live right here on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Beyond the Cage podcast. If you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button, the like button, the share button, all that good stuff there. And of course, as many fans know of the show, I usually have one or two co-hosts sitting next to me here. However, with the Memorial Day weekend we just had, both are still on vacation, that being Billy Brandt and Colin Camper. So I will be flying solo this week to talk to you about what's been happening in the world of combat sports. Now, on today's show, I already mentioned all that other stuff I'm going to cover. And also, you thought last week we had a big interview when I talked to Cody Garbrandt before this fight here, UFC Fight Night 88, which we'll get to in a little bit, but may have even outdone that interview and maybe outdone all the interviews we've had on the show, as later on in the program, before I get to my UFC 199 main card breakdown and picks, I'm interviewing one of those men fighting on the main card of UFC 199, that being the former Pride champion as well as Grand Prix champion, the man, the myth, the legend, the H-bomb himself, Dan Henderson, will be joining me here on the program to talk about his next UFC bout against Hector Lombard there at UFC 199. So that interview will be later on in the program. Very excited for it. I can't wait to talk to Dan Henderson and see what he has to say about his fight here against Hector Lombard. All right, let's get to the headlines here I want to talk about this week in combat sports, starting first with Glory. Glory 32 will be happening in Norfolk, Virginia, right on the coast there of the Atlantic Ocean, Friday, July 22nd. Glory, of course, has announced their Super Fight Series, which is the undercard exclusively shown on the UFC Fight Pass, for the card headlined by current featherweight champion Sergey Adamchuk, as he's once again set to defend his championship. And speaking of the featherweight division, probably the biggest bout to me on the Super Fight Series is not the headline bout, but I think it might as well should be here, as Shane Oblonsky will take on Giga Chikadze. For those of you who don't know, Chikadze had an incredible fight at Glory 27 in Chicago, which myself, Billy, and Colin were all in attendance at. And following his performance against Van Nostrand, we thought maybe Chikadze would factor into the title picture, even though at that time the Jaguar had yet to fight Adamchuk. But I think with another solid win over a tough guy here in Oblonsky, who's currently ranked number 4 in Glory's featherweight division, Giga right now is sitting at number 7. This could bode very well for him. And the fact that the champion, Adamchuk, is fighting on this card, that's another reason to try to impress not only the Glory matchmakers, but the champion himself, because that may be a fight he wants if he is successful in defending his title once again. Also excited, the main event, I guess you could say, of the Glory Super Fight Series. Chai Lewis Perry will take on Maurice Green Green, unfortunately, had a very tough fight in his last outing as he lost to Anderson Silva. And Lewis Perry, definitely a very dangerous dude. Is he's 6'9" in the heavyweight division, and you would think, wow, that guy's huge, which he is. But Green himself is 6'7", so this might be two of the tallest guys in the whole entire organization going toe to toe against each other, and that should be very, very interesting. Also in the welterweight division, almost won that welterweight contender tournament. Just it'll be about less than 2 months as Francois Ambang will take on Marcus Fisher there in the welterweight division. Fisher will be making his glory debut, 30-9 overall in his career. And again, Ambang 15-6 in his career. And with the win, really, Ambang is right back in the thick of things. He had a good performance in that tournament, even though it didn't go his way. He had a very close fight against Richard Abraham, which, again, we're trying to get on the show to talk about that tournament victory as well. So wanted to talk about that glory news before we move on to some UFC news. The UFC will be doing another version of one of their international Ultimate Fighters, TUF Latin America 3. Will be happening, I'm sure it'll be shown live in Latin America, but for most fans here in the United States and Canada, they will be able to see it on the UFC Fight Pass, which will debut on that service starting on August 20th. And the coaches, interesting, as it will not involve active fighters, which I think, at least for Latin America and really the history of the Ultimate Fighter, kind of unprecedented. But for Latin America, you know, it's not as big a thing. Most fans in the U.S. aren't going to get invested anyway, so it's not that big a deal that the coaches aren't going to be fighting each other. But it's an interesting matchup because you have Chuck Liddell, UFC Hall of Famer, former light heavyweight champion, as well as the first ever coach of the Ultimate Fighter. And he's coaching against one of the guys he coached on that very first season of the Ultimate Fighter, season 1 winner of the Ultimate Fighter, former light heavyweight champion, and also a UFC Hall of Famer himself. I'm talking about Forrest Griffin. He will be coaching against here on the 3rd season of the Latin American version of the Ultimate Fighter, with most of the contestants coming from Mexico and other countries there in Latin America, Chile, Colombia, Bolivia, Argentina, Peru. There's a Costa Rica in there as well. And I don't know if it'll get me to watch, but I find it interesting that also, I think for the first time, they're having coaches that aren't really speaking Spanish. And I wonder how big of a language barrier that will be for Liddell and Griffin trying to convey their points. In the previous seasons, you had Fabricio Verdum. Now, again, a native Portuguese speaker, but Portuguese isn't that much different than Spanish. I'm sure it was pretty easy for the fighters to pick him up and for him to pick up what the fighters are saying. And, of course, Cain Velasquez knows Spanish. Then you had season 2 in Calvin Gastelum against Efrain Escudero. Both, again, know how to speak Spanish. So that will be a very interesting twist to the show. Now, while these guys get to train with legends, and sometimes you don't quite need the language to figure out what they're doing, at the same time, it's very helpful. And I wonder how much that will pose a problem for Forrest and Truck trying to mentor these young fighters into potentially having a career in the Ultimate Fighting Championship. Moving on, let's get to UFC Fight Night 88, which happened this past weekend in Las Vegas, Nevada at Mandalay Bay. It was on Fox Sports 1. 6 fights were shown on the main card, and before we get to the main card action, I'm going to give a quick look over the undercard. Eric Koch had a very nice win, submitting Shane Campbell in the 2nd round via rear naked choke. And for Eric Koch, a guy once upon a time was going to get a shot at the UFC Featherweight Championship against Jose Aldo, he's kind of had a rough go of it lately in his career, not just losing, but also getting hurt. Since that proposed shot once upon a time, he got injured, ended up fighting Ricardo Lamas and Dustin Poirier back-to-back, losing both those fights. He then took on Rafael Oliveira, moving up to 155 pounds, winning his debut at that weight class with the first round knockout, then lost to Darren Cruikshank, getting knocked out in the first round. Took about a 2-year layoff before returning here against Shane Campbell here at UFC Fight Night 88 to defeat him in the second round. And this is a guy who's still very young in his career. He's only going to be 28 in October of this year, just 19 professional fights. I think he still has a future in this division, but definitely lost a lot of time and is trying to compete. Now 145 is even more crowded, and 155 is just as crowded as ever, but he has a lot of work to do. But it was a very nice story for him to come back and get a victory there at UFC Fight Night 88. Also, Abel Trujillo returned to the winning column, defeating Jordan Rinaldi. Also, Jake Collier winning one of the Performance of the Night bonus. Boy, he had a very nice performance, winning by spinning back kick over Alberto Yuta, and that was in the second round at the 106 marker. And, of course, two big fights that didn't make the main card, a matchup of top 10 fighters, one in the women's bantamweight division, the other in the men's bantamweight division. As both friends of the show, as we've had them on several times, Aljamain Sterling and Jessica Eye, unfortunately both lost close fights. Sterling losing a very close split decision to Brian Caraway, and Jessica Eye, I'm not really sure. Like they said, it was kind of a chess match. At least she heard Sarah McMahon after the fight saying, because both fighters had trained with each other. She said that when she was on the show, that being Jessica Eye. And I think you saw a lot of it. I think neither really was doing anything crazy. Neither was overextending themselves. And I think this fight was really in both girls' heads. And I think that led to rather a lackluster fight in terms of fans viewing. And to Sarah's credit, she did enough with the takedowns, getting the fight into her element to get the win, and much deservingly so. And for Jessica, this is now her third straight loss in a row. And when I was talking to her, she didn't seem that worried that if she lost this fight, she would be cut from the UFC. But it really doesn't look good to not only lose 3 fights in a row, but have that third fight be this one that wasn't really exciting. And while she's losing to top girls in Juliana Pena, Miesha Tate, and now Sarah McMahon, just overall since signing with the UFC, even if you count the Sarah Kaufman fight as a win instead of an overturned no decision in her UFC debut back in October of 2013, she would be 2-4 in the UFC, with her only win coming over Leslie Smith in November of 2014, which again, Leslie Smith is a girl who's fought some of her career at 125 pounds, much like Jessica Eye. I don't know how big of a win that really is. The win over Kaufman at the time was big, but now Kaufman's gone on to, she had that injury, the layoff. She's lost a couple more fights. That win doesn't hold a lot as merit as it once did back in 2013. And realistically, regardless of signing an 8-fight deal after beating Leslie Smith after she won, when she mentioned being on the show, she mentioned when she was on the show just before this fight, it still doesn't bode well. Not too many fighters survive being not cut, I should say, after 3 straight losses. So we'll see. I think as much as she had mixed feelings when I asked her about potentially moving back down to 125 pounds, if the UFC does intend to make that a full-fledged division, they're going to be testing it out here on June 18th as Laterna will take on Joanne Calderwood. But I think that's something she may have to consider, because she's going to have a very, very, very tough climb to get to a UFC title shot if she stays in this division, right now sitting at basically 1-4. And for Aljamain Sterling, first loss of his career, he lost it to a guy that's a very tough competitor in Brian Caraway, a guy that, you look at the stats, it definitely was a close fight, but Caraway was able to get this fight more in his favor. I think Sterling, while a very great top game and does have good submissions, not the best still off his back, still not the best striker, and that's still an area he's going to have to learn. And Caraway, to his credit, a lot of people don't like him, maybe don't like the way he fights. The guy is a very accomplished grappler, really knows his submissions, and when you bring the fight to that element, he's like a wormy guy. I don't know how to describe it, but he kind of has a way of turning things into his advantage. And when he was able to get the fight there, it definitely was more in his element. It was more leaning towards Brian Caraway, no matter how good of a grappler Aljamain Sterling really is. On the feet, it was probably more of a 50-50 battle, but once you kind of get it more into grappling, and I think that's probably why the judges went with Brian Caraway and gave him the nod in this one. Looking to the main card here at UFC Fight Night 88, it started first in the lightweight division as Paul Felder took on Josh Berkman. And if you go back to last week's pick segments, one of the reasons I picked Paul Felder was because I think his body and conditioning will hold up better at 155 pounds. Now, I believe I did misspoke and thought this was Berkman's first fight at 155. It was actually his second. The fight against KJ Nunes was not in the welterweight division, which was my mistake. Again, KJ is a guy that's moved up several times between 170 and 155, so I didn't think anything of it. But irregardless, Josh Berkman's second fight, still at 155, was going to be a tough weight cut. It still wasn't going to get that much easier. Now, Brian Stan on the broadcast did say it was a little bit easier for him this second time around, but you could still tell that he was struggling to do it. And I think in the first round, it showed some of the reasons probably why he wanted to move down there. He was going to be bigger. He was going to be stronger. He was able to land a lot of good combinations. He could pressure people because he is really good at doing that. He was at 170 and really took over that first round, even landed a takedown there. I thought he did a real good job of not allowing Felder that much space and really to get off those spinning attacks. Then around number two, I think that's when Berkman started to slow down. He wasn't throwing those same kicks. He wasn't landing those combinations. He wasn't getting the face of Paul Felder as much. Gave Paul Felder some room to breathe. And Felder, to me, really took advantage of it, outstriking Josh Berkman 22-5 in that second round. And then the third round, I thought, continued more of the same, outstriking the former World Series of Fighting champion 21-10 in that second frame. And while those numbers don't really jump off the stat line here in terms of crazy stats, Paul Felder kept that same pace pretty much throughout the fight. And he was just a better conditioned fighter. And I think just towards the end, Berkman just didn't have enough steam. And that's one of the disadvantages he has dropping down to 155. And for Paul Felder, this is a nice win over a long-time veteran, a tough guy to finish, to compete against. And Paul Felder gets another win after another tough win, his last fight against Darren Cruikshank. I think he's right back in the thick of things, just outside the top 15. Now, I know he took the fight last year in July at the UFC Fox in Chicago against Edson Barboza on short notice, but I think he's close to that type of opponent in the lower end of the top 15. And I think he's shown in that Edson Barboza fight that he can hang with these guys. And being two tough guys like Darren Cruikshank and Josh Berkman, I'm really excited for the future of Paul Felder. I know he spent a lot of time training with Don Cerrone out there at the ranch and Jackson's. Now he's training with guys like Frankie Edgar and Edson Barboza, Corey Anderson, among others over there in New Jersey. And that's a great training camp to lurk with. And I'm really excited to see what Paul Felder does next. And for Josh Berkman, boy, I don't know. He's probably getting close to retirement. I don't know if 155 is really the right fit for him. I know this was only his second fight. Took on a tough guy in Paul Felder, but maybe he gives it one more go and see if he can really make this class work. But I think it was kind of too late in the game for him to try a big switch like this and try to cut all that weight to get down to 155, especially with the UFC adding those new weight cut restrictions starting here in just about a month at UFC 200. Next fight of the evening was in the welterweight division as Jorge Masvidal took on Lorenz Larkin. Looking at this fight, very close fight. It ended up being a split decision for the Monsoon Lorenz Larkin. Looking at the striking numbers, actually Masvidal just a tad better, 60-58 in terms of land strike. Larkin, however, did throw 3 more total strikes, 136-133. Both were successful on 1 of 2 takedown attempts. I would say the big reason Larkin got this win, the bigger strikes, to me, the more impactful strikes were being thrown by Lorenz Larkin, in my opinion. And looking at this fight, every round was super close. I think the first round definitely was Lorenz Larkin. He tagged him a couple times. I thought landed a very nice barrage of kicks. Rounds 2 and 3 were really close. I think you can maybe make a case for either round. I thought Masvidal probably won round 2. The striking numbers at least back him up there. 25-19 in favor of Gamebred. And round 3, again, very close. Despite getting outstruck by 4, that being Larkin, 22-18, I did think he won that round. Again, was landing more of the kicks. I thought he was landing the better combinations. And the biggest difference in me for Larkin's performance, as opposed to his last fight against Albert Tumov, he definitely let his hands go a lot more. He was definitely throwing more combinations. And I think for some reason he got away from that in the Tumenov fight. I don't know if it was Tumenov's style, the way he was just walking forward, eating the leg kick, or maybe he's too overconfident because that leg kick was landing so much. But in this fight, he was able to do what he does best and really throw those combinations. And I think that's where he was having success. And for Masvidal, he had a good second round, but I think too much he was reacting to Larkin. He wasn't attacking enough, in my opinion. He really wasn't going after it, in my opinion. And I think that's one of the reasons why the judges went the way of the Monsoon Lorenz Larkin, who gets a very nice bounce-back victory after his last fight against Tumenov. Heading into the next fight, middleweight division, Chris Camozzi against Vitor Miranda. I picked Chris Camozzi heading into this fight, and despite the knockouts power that Miranda has shown in his career, and especially so far in the UFC, but Chris Camozzi is one of those guys that's just a hardworking guy. He's a grinder, awkward matchup. He's never been knocked out before in his career, and I thought he was also the better conditioned fighter. And I thought for Miranda, a guy that really only just puts away people with strikes, at least that's really all I've seen from him, I thought it was going to be hard to be doing that to Chris Camozzi and be getting him in bad spots, especially with just striking. You really, when you've seen Chris Camozzi have trouble in the UFC, it's guys that are tremendous grapplers. That's really who has given him a lot of problems so far in the UFC. Guys that can take him out of that coming forward, taking shots, awkward stances, and also being able to get inside his reach as well to take him down. Make him work against you, work to get out of positions instead of working to get in positions against you. And Vitor Miranda wasn't able to do that. As Chris Camozzi was pretty much able to do what he wanted to Vitor in this fight, and officially only took him down once in this fight. But Chris Camozzi had several minutes of ground control throughout this fight. Just really did a good job of not allowing Vitor to get space and get off those power shots. And Camozzi just did a great job of taking him out of his game. And it was a great 3-round performance, a very dominating win for the man from Colorado. And I'm excited to see what comes next for him. I really think since coming back to the UFC, boy, he's looked a lot different than his first go. And he's in way better shape. I think he's a better striker. I think he's a better grappler. And also I think he's coming up with better game plans. And I don't know if he'll ever be champion. I'm not sure if he'll get to that level. But he's a hard guy to match up with because of his size and strength and work ethic. And I think he can create problems for people here in this middleweight division. Heading into the next fight of the evening, Rick Story took on Tarek Saffiedine, another close fight here in the welterweight division. Rick Story coming off that long layoff after neck surgery. And after, I thought, a close first round one, I maybe would have gave to Saffiedine, despite Saffiedine getting outstruck by 14. I thought Saffiedine did a great job in that first round, really all fight, stopping the takedown of Rick Story, which I thought was an X factor because of Story's wrestling background. But that first round, I thought Saffiedine did a good job avoiding the power shots and added in some nice kicks. And rounds 2 and 3, despite stopping the takedown, I don't know if it was the power of Story, the way he was able to walk through those kicks, or if Saffiedine was too worried about defending the takedown, because I felt like he just wasn't there in rounds 2 and 3. I mean, he wasn't getting overly dominated by Rick Story. Now, the striking numbers paint a picture of Story really like teeing off on him. 31-18 landed strikes in round 2 and 39-16 in round number 3, not to mention the output. Story in round number 2 threw 13 more strikes and threw 30 more strikes in round 3. So to me, the output just wasn't there from Tarek Saffiedine. He was landing good shots, but he wasn't doing it enough. and Story just keeps on coming forward. And I thought his conditioning may be a little bit of a question mark with the long layoff, but he looked like classic Rick Story. Kept on moving forward, just keeps throwing hard shots. And he didn't get the takedown, which I thought may be a key to him winning this fight. But I think the threat of the takedown and that grueling style, being such a big, strong guy, getting Saffiedine up in the cage, just even working for the takedown, I think may have also wore Saffiedine a little bit out. And when it came to the striking exchanges, Rick Story was getting better of the man from Belgium. And this is a very nice win for Rick Story, looking to reestablish himself in an always crowded welterweight division. And this was a nice win for him coming back. And I think him against the guy just talked about a couple fights ago in Lorenz Larkin would be an incredible fight. And the winner would definitely be in the top 15 in the division, maybe even top 10 with a win. And just the power those two guys possess. And I just think that would be a tremendous fight. I don't know if that will happen next, but I think that would be a good fight down the road. The co-main event of the evening was in the featherweight division as former bantamweight champion Hen Brow made his promotional debut at 145 pounds against a longtime UFC fighter, Jeremy Stephens. I picked Hen Brow before this fight because I thought his speed, his ability to strike from the outside, a pretty good jiu-jitsu guy and also a very tough guy to take down in his own right. He's never been taken down in any of his UFC fights. Thought that might bode some trouble for Jeremy Stephens. In the first round, you saw that. You saw Hen Brow stop the takedown. You saw Hen Brow even try to take down Stephens a couple times. Now, it didn't work out great, but you saw Brow, you saw the speed, you saw him avoiding the big power, slower shots of Jeremy Stephens. And that first round was amazing. Second and third round, not as much. And the second round, you wouldn't think conditioning would be as big of an issue for Hen Brow moving up a weight class. But maybe all that bouncing around, moving on the outside, maybe kind of just slowed Brow down enough in round two to get tagged several times by Jeremy Stephens in that round. And really, Stephens did a great job in that round, outstriking Brow 35-12. Brow, however, did land one takedown. It didn't last very long as he was 1 of 4 on his takedown attempts. And in between that, Stephens showed his size, his strength, and just overall punching power in this division. To me, really took over round two. Round three, a little closer. I think Stephens, again, missed a lot in that first round, landed a lot more in the second, but he was tired himself. Brow, I think, was trying to just survive in that third round. He definitely was even slower in round three than he was in round two. Tried a couple more takedown attempts. Again, landed one more takedown in round three. Didn't do much with it. Definitely kind of a slugfest. Like I said, I think Jeremy Stephens starting to slow down a little bit as well. The first time he really showed any signs of fatigue in this fight. Again, he threw all those power shots. Eventually, you're going to wear down a little bit. But again, his shots were landing a little more often and a little harder. And I think definitely won that third round, in my opinion, to get the win, and ended up being fight of the night there at UFC Fight Night 88. And for Hen Brow, and I think he can fight at this weight class, but he needs to fight more like he did in round number one. And I don't know if some people have brought up rumblings, fans on the internet and rumors and forum columns and all that, brought up that maybe he's been on in the past some performance enhancing drugs. And now with the UFC really cracking down on certain substances, could be the reason why he's moving up a weight class, could be a reason why maybe his conditioning isn't as good. I don't know. I can't say with 100% certainty that is the case, but he definitely is not the same guy that won like 32 fights in a row and claimed the UFC Bantamweight Championship. Now, Jeremy Stephens is a tough guy. He's beaten top guys in 2 different divisions. So this is not a slouch or anything that Hen Brow lost to, but this is now 3 out of his last 4 fights he has lost. He only lost 1 fight in his whole entire career heading into that first fight against TJ Dillashaw. Now he's lost 3 out of his last 4. So Hen Brow's still a young guy. I believe he's 27 years old. So he still has a lot left in his career, in my opinion. But he's going to have to work out which weight class he wants to fight at, and he's going to have to work on his conditioning regardless of the weight class, because if he's going to fade after 5 minutes, then he's not going to put too many guys away, especially at 145 with bigger guys. So he's going to have to definitely make an adjustment moving forward. And for Jeremy Stephens, another nice victory here after a very tough and close fight against Max Holloway. To me, he's right back in the thick of things here in the top 10 of the featherweight division. Main event of the evening in the men's bantamweight division, Cody Garbrandt against Thomas Almeida. Of course, we had Cody on before the fight to talk about this, and I kind of asked him, what do you expect from this fight? Do you expect it to go the 25 minutes? And he was pretty confident that he could finish Almeida in the first round. And he said, if I don't, I'll finish him in the second. And that's exactly what he did. He was a man of his word, as he finished Thomas Almeida in just one round. And really, this fight kind of reminded me a little bit, at least for Almeida, of the Brad Pickett fight, where Almeida didn't really have a great round against Brad Pickett that first round. It wasn't until later that he ended up attempting and winning the fight by that flying knee. But I think he gave Cody Garbrandt too much room in this, and I think he was maybe looking to counter too much. And really, to me, what has made Almeida successful is him moving forward, and he was allowing Cody to move forward and land on him, and the counters were not there for Thomas. You look at the striking numbers, 22 of 10 in favor of Garbrandt, and you look at that output in just 253 into round one, already double for Garbrandt, 49 to 25 in favor of the man from Ohio. So right there, he wasn't attacking enough. He wasn't going after Cody. He really didn't try much of a grappling attack. In fact, no official takedowns by the Brazilian. I thought that was an X factor if this fight got to the ground. Cody is an accomplished high school wrestler, but he's not a jiu-jitsu guy. He's not a submission guy. What happens if you put him on his back? What will he do? How will he perform? And I thought that was a good X factor for a guy who, despite having a lot of knockouts, does have some submission and grappling ability he doesn't often show. So I thought that was an X factor. We didn't get to see that again. These two guys just both 24 years old in their career, two of the bright stars. And now, I think Gambrandt's moved from prospect to title contender overnight with this victory. And I think Thomas will be back. I think these two their paths will meet again, possibly for a championship or another number one contender fight. We may see a trilogy between these two, but Almeida, it was just simply, he can't sit back and wait against a striker like Cody Garbrandt. Some other guys in this division you can do that with, but you can't do that against Cody, and he paid the price getting knocked out in the first round. Moving on to my interview here with Dan Henderson. I talk about his fight here at UFC 199 against Hector Lombard that I did earlier in the week. So let's go to that interview right now. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of Beyond the Cage. I'm your host, Jim Gramm, and joining me today on the line, we have a special guest. He will be fighting Hector Lombard on pay-per-view at UFC 199. He is the legend Dan Henderson. And Dan, thanks for joining me here on Beyond the Cage.
Thank you. I appreciate it. No problem.
Now, Dan, I want to ask you quickly about what was supposed to be your last fight against Lyoto Machida. He had to pull out of the fight back in April due to admitting to the use of a banned substance. And now, you were pretty upset at the time having to pull out of that fight just days before. Are you still upset about that, or has things kind of cooled over for you now that you have this fight here against Hector?
Well, yeah. I was upset then, and yeah, I'm still upset I didn't get paid, but it is what it is, and yeah, I'm just looking forward now and looking forward to Saturday and beating up Hector Lombard now.
Now, has that whole thing with Machida, has that soured you on an idea on a potential rematch in the future against him?
Well, I'm sure he'll have some sort of suspension for a while, and I don't know what's going to happen. I wasn't overly excited to fight him again anyway. I just don't think he's an exciting matchup for me to fight, for the fans to watch. But I felt like there was a lot of pressure on me to make sure that fight was exciting, and I don't have that pressure against somebody like Hector. So I doubt I'll ever fight Machida again.
Now, looking at your matchup here against Hector Lombard, of course, moving up a weight class, has fought most of his UFC career at 170 pounds. Do you see that as any sort of advantage, being a bigger and taller guy in this weight class than Hector?
Well, I don't know if I'm bigger than him. I'm definitely taller, but not that much taller. He gets pretty big and thick, and he's pretty powerful. So, I think he's used to fighting guys that are longer and taller than him just because of his body style. And I just need to make sure that I'm careful and not get caught with some hard punches and make sure that I punish him and make him work.
Considering how Hector Lombard's last fight went against Neil Magny, where he had a super dominant first round and then really fell off in rounds 2 and 3, eventually getting finished by Neil Magny, is it a big point to you to get this fight out of the first round to make sure that you have this fight go on longer? Do you think that goes to your advantage?
Well, he is definitely more dangerous towards the beginning of fights. So the longer the fight goes, the less dangerous he is. And he kind of tapers off a little bit with his gas tank. So I need to just make sure I'm making him work from the beginning bell and make him work throughout the whole fight and try and break him like Neil Magny did.
Do you expect this fight to go the full 15 minutes?
I expect every fight to go, the full distance, and that's what I prepare for. Obviously, I'm hoping to get a knockout early or a submission, but I know that with both of our styles, we both like to come forward and throw hard, and there's a good chance he'll get caught.
Now, I wanted to get your thoughts on the main event because it is in your division, the middleweight division, as Luke Rockhold takes on Michael Bisping for the second time. How do you think that matchup's going to play out, Dan?
It probably goes similar to the first time they fought. I think Luke's just able to move on his feet well and not get outpointed by Michael Bisping. And Bisping will have a tough time taking him down. And if he does take him down, Luke's pretty sneaky and dangerous on the ground. So, I don't think Bisping's style is very good for somebody like Luke.
All right, I'll get you out of here with this. We have a mutual friend in AJ Hiller who owns MMA Signatures USA.com. And he told me this story one time when he was visiting you out there in California, that he was riding around with you in your truck, and he noticed that one of your pride belts were in the truck, and he had mentioned to you, like, hey, did you know your pride belt was in here? And he goes, oh, that, and you said something to the effect of, oh, that's where I left it. And I was wondering, is that a true story that you kind of forgot where you put your pride belt?
For a while, I didn't really have them in any set place, and I know I had taken them to my gym for a couple times, and I think one got left in my car, and my wife has them displayed nice now, and but before that, I never had them displayed at all. They were either in a storage bin or I'd take them to my gym occasionally for something. So I guess there's a little bit of truth to that.
All right, he is the legend Dan Henderson. You can follow him on Twitter and Instagram at Dan Hendo. And Dan, thanks again for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. I look forward to your fight against Hector Lombard at UFC 199.
No problem. Thank you.
Once again, that was Dan Henderson, and you heard him right here on Beyond the Cage. For more about UFC 199, stay tuned for the rest of the show right here on YouTube. As you just heard, my interview there with Dan Henderson up ahead of his fight here at UFC 199. Once again, it was great to talk to Dan and hear what he had to say about his upcoming fight here this weekend at the Forum in Los Angeles here at UFC 199 on pay-per-view this Saturday, June 4th. Let's get to the main card here of UFC 199 before I get to picks here for the main card. Of course, I'm your host, Jim Gramm, and normally joining me is Billy and Colin. They are not here this week, taking a little extended vacation for Memorial Day that we just had here in the United States. So Billy's on Twitter at WBrand21, and of course you can check Colin running our Facebook page, facebook.com/Beyond the Cage podcast. Please like it today. And Colin is also a moderator and also content provider, throwing up some questions and opinions and whatnot for our good friends at MMA Fight Club on Facebook. And they are set to be launching their website very, very soon here, MMAFightClub.net. But again, check them out. As I mentioned, Colin running their Facebook page, help running their Facebook page, I should say, at facebook.com/MMA Fight Club. All right, now, I forgot to mention this before I get to 199. I want to talk a little bit about the bantamweight picture just real quickly. Cody Garbrandt, of course, made a name for himself winning this fight here against Thomas Almeida, and his training partner, who I asked him about, Uriah Faber, having a fight this weekend. So that should be interesting, and I will get into that just a second. But just in case people were listening to the breakdown I gave before the Dan Henderson interview thinking, oh, they usually talk about what's next. Well, I'm going to get to it. I just want to talk about it in its whole and entirety. So starting off the 199 card, it should be pretty interesting here, as Dustin the Diamond Poirier will take on Bobby Green. It's been a while since we have seen Bobby Green here in the octagon, as he takes on number 11 ranked Dustin Poirier. And Bobby Green, a guy that's a very tough guy. 23-6 in his career, 8 of 23 wins by knockout. He also has 9 submissions to his credit. Hasn't fought in about 18 months since losing to Edson Barboza in November of 2014. And up until that loss, he had a very nice run dating back to September of 2011, where he was able to win 8 consecutive fights. And in that time, he beat the likes of Jacob Volman, James Krause, Pat Healy, and Josh Thompson. And that loss, his last loss before Edson Barboza, was JC Cavalcante, also a very tough guy. For that, Tim Means, very tough guy. So he's really only lost to tough guys in his career. And this layoff, I think, definitely hurts. Again, as I've mentioned earlier with Rick Story, 155 is a division that's always stacked, and losing 18 months, even if it's to injury or just wanting a break, it's tough. And no joke, coming back, take on Dustin Poirier, who since moving up to 155 pounds from being very successful at 145 pounds, has been nothing short of fantastic, as he's beaten Carlos Diego Ferreira, Yancy Medeiros, and most recently just dominating Joe Duffy for 3 rounds at UFC 195. He's looked absolutely fantastic. And against Bobby Green, you're taking on a guy that's tough to take down, has solid stand-up, definitely has good footwork, can get in your face. And to beat Dustin Poirier, he has to do what he did against Edson Barboza, not allowing Poirier to get a lot of room, trap him, be aggressive. But unlike what he did against Edson Barboza, he has to pull the trigger. He has to have output. He can't just simply trap Dustin Poirier. Now, Dustin Poirier will have, I don't know if he has more power than Barboza, but I think he's more maybe apt to grapple than Edson Barboza. And I think that is an X factor. That is a counter to Bobby Green trying to stop him in terms of his movement and cut him off and using the angles and whatnot. I think that's a big difference taking on Dustin Poirier as opposed to Edson Barboza. You add in the layoff, and not to say Bobby Green doesn't have good conditioning, but with Poirier moving up to this weight class 155, he definitely has better conditioning. And I think being more active recently than Bobby Green, I think also helps you too. And one of the reasons maybe Bobby Green layoff, I don't think it was necessarily injury. It could have maybe been a loss of drive, the loss to Barbosa. It could be any number of factors, but Dustin Poirier has definitely looked like a different man since moving up to 155 pounds. And definitely the streak, the man on the roll is Dustin Poirier. Before we talk about the Dan Henderson fights, of course, I already mentioned a little bit. I want to talk about the undercard here. I think we've got a pretty solid undercard. Kevin Casey against Elvis Mustachis, the highlight fight of the Fight Pass part of the prelim. That undefeated prospect out of England, Tom Breeze, taking on Sean Strickland, one of the more American prospects here in the welterweight division. So that should be a very interesting fight. 10-0 against 17-1. On the FS1 prelims, we have Cole Miller taking on Bruce Leroy. Of course, Cole Miller was supposed to be taking on BJ Penn. BJ Penn was then originally supposed to take on Dennis Seaver. Now it's Cole Miller against Bruce Leroy. Still excited for this fight. I really like Bruce Leroy. He's very rarely a boring fighter. We'll see. Bruce Leroy taking on a very tough grappler here in Cole Miller. It should be interesting. I still think it's a fun fight. I mean, it's not BJ Penn, but I still think it's a solid fight. Jessica Penne finally gets back in there as this will be her first fight since losing to Joanna Jędrzejczyk for the strawweight title last year. That's how long it's been since Jessica Penne has been there. She's taking on the ever tough Jessica Andrade. And I think for Andrade, if I looked this up correctly, I thought she used to fight at bantamweight, and that is correct, as her last fight in the UFC was last September as she fought Raquel Pennington and lost. So this will be an interesting jumping down, in theory, 2 weight classes, because even though the UFC doesn't have one, most organizations that have female fighting will have a 125 division. So she's jumping basically 2 weight classes to take on Jessica Penne, who, again, at one point in her career fought 105 pounds at atomweight, was the first ever Invicta atomweight champion before losing to her successor in Michelle Waterson, who now is in the UFC at 115. So this is a very interesting fight. I'm really, again, Andrade's first battle is the scale and then Jessica Penne, but that's going to be very interesting to see someone make that jump. Also at 155 pounds, James Vick will take on Beneil Dariush. Interesting, Beneil Dariush just lost to a guy who won the seasonal Ultimate Fighter that James Vick was on in Michael Chiesa. Vick has looked excellent. He's definitely a brawler. He's a guy that can take a punch, so he can land one. Super tall in this weight class at 6'5", taking on just 5'10" in Beneil Dariush, who had a great first round against Michael Chiesa. Not a great second round, as he ended up then getting submitted in the second round. But I think that's an interesting fight. And Dariush currently ranked number 10 in the UFC's lightweight rankings. So he's trying to stay relevant in a stacked division after losing his last fight. Really make a case his last 2 if you thought that he lost to Michael Johnson in his previous fight before Chiesa. And James Vick, this is his first real step up in competition. So far in his career, really, if you look at his competition, I didn't think he's fought that great of competition. To me, the best fighter he's fought so far is Jake Matthews, who he did beat, but he was looking bad in that fight until catching Matthews in a submission. So I got Nick Hines solid. All right, I'll give him Nick Hines and Jake Matthews, but I still think Dariush is a step above both those gentlemen at this stage in all fighters' career. And like I said, Beneil Dariush definitely has something to prove after that last fight losing there to Michael Chiesa. Brian Ortega, T-City, man. Bright prospect here in the featherweight division, taking on longtime UFC veteran, the Carpenter, Clay Guida. And Guida at this stage in his career is a gatekeeper, but if T-City can get past Clay Guida, that's a big deal. Ortega currently ranked 12th in the UFC's now stacked featherweight division. And for Guida, I think he's just fighting to fight at this point. You know, he's definitely past his prime, but he's still a tough matchup and still a tough out even at this stage in his career, this will be his 46th professional fight. Still a tough fight for a young guy in Brian Ortega, and we'll see if he can rise to the occasion against a tough competitor like Clay Guida. All right, as I said, let's get back to that main card. Dan Henderson against Hector Lombard. Of course, you just heard Dan Henderson talk all about this fight against Hector Lombard. And to me, the big difference in this fight and what could end up being the downfall for Hector Lombard will be the height and reach advantage he'll have to overcome. Now, while Dan Henderson's not an overly big middleweight or overly that much bigger than Hector Lombard, he still is a little bit taller, a little bit bigger. Henderson's fought all the way up to heavyweight, going back to Pride days and Fedor. So he's used to taking on bigger guys, stronger guys. He can still take a punch. He can still throw a punch. Grappling, I think Henderson, despite having a good pedigree, Lombard even has a better one. But I think their wrestling and grappling kind of negate each other. I think that either will have a tough time taking each other down. Really, that's never been each other's MO. I guess Lombard at times will, but he's really likes to stand and throw, and especially at 185 pounds where he doesn't have to worry about cutting as much weight, I think he will cut loose, but it's going to be tough to get inside Dan Henderson, who, if you ask Shogun, who can still counter you when he's hurt. And I think for Lombard, despite moving up a weight class, I think he has to try to put Dan Henderson away quickly. He kind of has to be like Vitor Belfort. You got to put him away quickly. You got to rush him quickly, because if you let Dan Henderson stay around long enough, he will land one of those H-bombs and put you to sleep. Next fight of the evening, speaking of the stacked featherweight division, two guys looking to get to the top, and for Lamas looking to get back there, as number 5 ranked Ricardo Lamas will take on 4 ranked Max Holloway. Fortunately for these two gentlemen, the winner still may have to wait for the title shot with the cluster that is going on there between Jose Aldo, Frankie Edgar, and of course the reluctant champion, I should say, in Conor McGregor. But this is a very big step for either to move closer to that featherweight title shot. And grappling-wise, definitely got to give the edge to Ricardo Lamas. I definitely think he is the better grappler in this fight, definitely the better wrestler. I don't know necessarily if he has better submissions, but he definitely, I think, has to get this fight to the ground. I think he is a solid striker, but Max Holloway with that long, lanky frame, he knows how to use it. He knows how to strike from the outside. He knows how to attack guys coming forward. I think he really has developed into one of the best strikers in this division. And I think Lamas, while a solid striker and did have a good performance in his last fight against Diego Sanchez, I still think you're giving Max his best chance to win by standing at range and striking with him. I think you got to get up in his face. You got to keep a grinding, grueling pace, keep him up against the cage, not allow him to use that lanky frame of his to get out of the way of your punches and cut angles and all that he's capable of doing. You got to make him work. You got to make him work for everything. You got to make him work for striking opportunities. You got to make him work for advantageous grappling positions. You got to make him work to get out of the clinch and work to get his back off the cage. Because I think if you just stand and go in there and kind of plod and go around like we have seen Lamas do in his career striking-wise, I just don't see him winning. And I think Max Holloway is going to win. And for Holloway, you got to be expecting Lamas to take this fight to the ground. If he doesn't, then boy, you know, he's blessed. Count your blessings and just be grateful that he's trying to match you at your own game. Co-main event of the evening in the bantamweight division. As I mentioned, I will talk about the bantamweight division a little bit as a whole. Huge fight here. Of course, it's for the championship. But a lot of big things can happen. A lot of matchups, a lot of storylines can happen with this fight. Of course, Cody Garbrandt, fresh off that victory, he's primed for a number 1 contender shot. He's already called out Brian Caraway. I think that's a very excellent matchup. Again, before the fight, we talked about the winner of Caraway Sterling possibly fighting the winner of Garbrandt and Almeida. And I think that is a very real possibility. Of course, as we were talking to Cody before the fight, he really seemed adamant about fighting in his hometown of Cleveland at UFC 203. Him against Brian Caraway, I think, will be an excellent fight and definitely could be a number 1 contender matchup. But of course, you have a fight coming up just about a month away at UFC 200 as Rafael Sunsao will take on TJ Dillashaw in a rematch. And that also has a lot of storylines coming to it, too, for the winner. If Asunción, again, it's the second straight victory over TJ Dillashaw, and he continues on his winning streak. Dillashaw, of course, had a rift, left Team Alpha Male. So him taking on Uriah Faber, his former coach, mentor, and friend, training partner, that's a big deal. Of course, Cruz is victorious, and TJ Dillashaw gets, of course, the rematch between Cruz and Dillashaw. You can see the poster behind it. I think, again, would be an excellent fight. But getting to this fight, I'm very excited for this fight. Of course, this fight was supposed to happen about 4 years ago, that being the third fight between Dominick Cruz and Uriah Faber, following the conclusion of the first ever Ultimate Fighter shown live. That was when it was on FX. Of course, that didn't happen. Dominick Cruz got hurt and, of course, was out for a very long time, only fighting once in about 3 years. And for Uriah Faber, he says he doesn't want to go 0-4 in title shots. That could be the case here in LA. But to me, win or lose, this is Uriah Faber's last fight. This is his last chance to capture the one thing in a lot of people's minds that he is missing from his resume as a fighter, and that being a UFC championship. Now, while winning a WEC championship is all fine and dandy, when you move up to an organization that at the time and now is the big deal regardless of weight classes, and you haven't won that championship, a lot of people, this legacy, some people don't care about legacies and where they stand and what fans think of them, but for Uriah Faber, I don't think it's so much about legacy. I think it's a point of pride. I think he just wants to say that he was a UFC champion. I mean, he knows that he's been a champion of the sport, that he's been to the top of the hill, that he has nothing left to prove to anybody, but I think he wants to prove this to himself, that he can become a UFC champion. And his last fight against Frankie Saenz, it started to look like a guy that was definitely slowing down, a guy that definitely is good and could beat a lot of guys in the bantamweight division, even on their best day. But you could tell that you could see a decline in a guy that's always been in tremendous shape, and you saw a little bit of that in Frankie Saenz. Now, Cruz, to me, answered just about all the questions he needed to answer in his win over TJ Dillashaw. Could he take kicks to the leg? He did. Could he still move that same way for 25 minutes? He did. Could he still have that same elusiveness in avoiding strikes that he did? Yeah, he did. Could he still be able to stop takedown and be effective, kind of wrestling in reverse like he has been in his career? Absolutely. So to me, he answered just about all those questions in that fight against TJ Dillashaw. And to me, if there was going to be a time to beat Dominick Cruz, it was going to be that fight coming off such a long layoff. And if Dillashaw, a guy definitely in the prime of his career, couldn't do it, I don't know if his former coach, friend, and training partner, Uriah Faber, now at the tail end of his career, can't do it. Now, their fight all the way back, I believe it was UFC 132, was the last time that these two guys met. It was a close 5-round decision that time went the way of Dominick Cruz. Just to double check my timing here. That was UFC 132. That was July of 2011, so nearly 5 years ago rather than 4. But I just think that Cruz right now, this is his fight to lose. And I've never really seen Cruz off his game, to be honest. I mean, his one loss in his career was to Uriah Faber. When Uriah Faber was in the prime of his career, Cruz was a young up-and-comer, got caught in a quit submission in the WC for the WC Featherweight Championship. And I don't know. I've never seen Cruz mess up. I really think short of Cruz just doing something wrong, or I guess it's possible because he gets hurt a lot, getting injured, I think anything Uriah Faber throws at Dominick Cruz, he will be able to handle. And while I want to root for Uriah Faber just so he can say he got that championship, he got to the top of the hill in the UFC, it just, unfortunately, I think his time when he would have done it I guess I was correct in saying they were going to fight 4 years ago, but their last time that was 5 years ago. I think his time to win that championship might have been if they would have been able to fight a third time like 4 years ago. Main event of the evening, Luke Rockhold against Michael Bisping for the second time. This time, however, for the UFC middleweight championship, as Rockhold puts his title on the line for the first time. Michael Bisping getting this title shot after Chris Weidman pulled out of this fight due to injury. And while many thought Jacare Souza should get the fill-in spot following his win over Vitor Belfort at UFC 198, Jacare Souza, after the fight, had already scheduled to have some knee surgery, so he was out. So Michael Bisping, who was sitting, I'm not sure if he was actually sitting number 4 in the rankings. That's where the UFC has him now, but definitely in the top 5 following his main event victory over Anderson Silva in February. He gets the shot. Now, while it was a close fight for what it lasted for about 1.5 rounds, their first time in Sydney, Australia, Luke Rockhold got the better of Michael Bisping, submitting the Brit in the second round. And while I don't think that will happen this time around, I think this is Luke Rockhold's fight. Now, Michael Bisping's always been in tremendous shape. He has good cardio. He's good size for his weight class. He's tough to take down. He is a good grappler. I think that loss against Rockhold was only the second time in his career he's been submitted. Actually, that's the only time in his career he's ever been submitted. So he's a tough guy to submit. Heck, he's only been knocked out twice in his career, and he hasn't been knocked out since his loss to Vitor Belfort in January of 2013. So while Rockhold submit him, I think it will be a closer fight this time around, but the short notice thing doesn't really bother me too much. I think Michael Bisping wasn't going to be that much more prepared against Luke Rockhold with a full camp. I think the fact that he's already fought him, I think helps the fact he's taking on short notice because he kind of knows what to correct this time around. So I think the short notice will help him. For Luke Rockhold, he's such a well-rounded fighter that it definitely is not going to faze him having to change from worrying about Chris Weidman to worrying about Michael Bisping. I don't think that's going to change his game plan at all. And I really just think Luke Rockhold is just a better fighter. I really do. It's not something that's overly technical with Luke Rockhold, but I think he's a little taller. He's a little longer. I think he's a little better grappler. I think he hits a little harder. I think he's just a little better conditioning. I think he's just a little better than Michael Bisping. I really do. And while Bisping, again, crazy things can happen. You know, injuries can happen during the course of a fight. You know, he could win, become the champion. I think it's deserved. You know, after all these years of fighting in the UFC, of finally getting title shot, I think it was deserved. You know, when Jacare wasn't able to go for this fight, and I was glad they were able to keep Rockhold on this card, but I don't know. He has a tough going. He really does, whether it was short notice or not. All right, let's get to my picks here for UFC 199. Of course, you will see who Billy and Colin pick if you go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/Beyond the Cage podcast. Click on the notes section. You'll see our picks here for UFC 199, or complete records for picking the main cards of the UFC fights this year. Starting first at 155 pounds, Dustin Poirier against Bobby Green. If Bobby Green didn't have this long layoff, I would probably lean towards the king, Bobby Green, but one of the things I like to say on the show is I like to pick the guys on the roll. And right now, Dustin Poirier is on the roll, so give me the diamond to win this one. Dan Henderson against Hector Lombard. Not saying this just because he was on the show, but I like Dan Henderson. I think Hector Lombard definitely has a chance to win this fight, but to me, he almost has to max out in the first round. Now, while he should have better conditioning, as I mentioned earlier in my preamble to this fight, I think he's going to have a tough time putting away a guy like Dan Henderson, and I think Henderson will be able to land an H-bomb and win this fight. I would find a surprise to go all 3 rounds, though. I really do. These guys have too much power for this to go 15 minutes. Next fight of the evening in the featherweight division, Max Holloway against Ricardo Lamas. Jeremy Stephens had trouble taking him down. Now, while I think Ricardo Lamas is a little better wrestler than Jeremy Stephens, I think he's going to have a tough time taking this one to the ground and standing. There's very few, I think, that are at Max Holloway's level right now. There's probably just 3 guys ahead of him, Aldo, McGregor, and Edgar. And I don't think Lamas, striking-wise, is at that level. And he can win this fight, absolutely. But I got to go, again, guy on the roll. Max Holloway's won like 7 fights in a row, and I think it will continue here at UFC 199. Dominic Cruz against Uriah Faber for the Bantamweight Championship of the World, the 3rd time these two will meet. And as I said in the breakdown, Uriah Faber, I think, is going to give it all that he has for this fight. Like I said, I think it could be the last fight of his career, win or lose. I think he's just maxed out in this fight, but I'm just not sure what he can do to really better Dominick Cruz. Dominick Cruz is not a guy that normally messes up or really gives people a lot of openings. And I think really short of an injury or some weird, crazy mistake that Dominick Cruz makes, I think it's going to be a tough going for the California kid, and give me Dominick Cruz to defend his title. Main event, middleweight championship on the line, Luke Rockhold against Michael Bisping. This one I think could go the distance. I think even their first fight could have went the distance, but I think this time around it may go the distance. But if anyone's getting to finish, I think it may be Luke Rockhold. I just think that he's a little better than Michael Bisping. Again, all it takes is one punch or crazy fluke or injury for Bisping to become champion. But Luke Rockhold right now, I think, is at the top of his game, and I think that he's the best fighter in the world at this weight class, and I think he's going to show it defending his title for the first time against Michael Bisping. Once again, I'm your host, Jim Gramm. You can follow me on Twitter at Jim Gramm. And thank you again for listening to today's show. Went solo today. Again, thanks for Dan Henderson joining. And, of course, Billy or Colin, one of them, will be joining me next week to break down this card as well. I already mentioned, but give a shout-out once again to our friends at MMAFightClub.net and, of course, the Facebook page, MMA Fight Club, friends at MMAinsider.net, MMAforlife.ca, top-rated MMA.com, and, of course, our friend AJ Hiller running MMASignaturesUSA.com, the #1 site for mixed martial arts memorabilia. For Billy and Colin, who normally join me, I am your host, Jim Gramm. Thank you again for listening to another edition of Beyond the Cage.